It's just a huge pleasure to welcome Aida Cuni-Sanchez. Aida started her career at the University of Southampton, where she worked in West Africa on non-timber forest products, which she informed me, of course, was before we were bothered about carbon stocks. But then after her PhD, with all that experience already in the field in West Africa, she moved to work at a postdoctoral level at the Royal Society of Protection of Birds, who were beginning to think about carbon in their Gola Forest programme. And then Ida's become a very, very well-travelled postdoc, with postdocs, to name a few, at the UCL in London, Copenhagen, Denmark, Colorado State University in the US. So incredibly well-travelled as a postdoc for many years. And then finally has moved to the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, where she's taken up an associate professorship to build her own independent group. And I just think that Ida's work on the natural science side has been spectacular in I must say, in terms of the sheer quantity of field biology that she's done. I think it's breathtaking, amazing, hardcore, right from West Africa through the Congo Basin into those African mountains. Incredible amount of plant plot data. And then always probably maintaining that interest, but now really again returning a bit to the more social side as well, of how we conserve and how lands are managed and how we deal with complex challenges. So it's a great pleasure, Aida, to welcome you to give it the talk for the centre, and we very much look forward to hearing your talk. Thanks.
Thank you, David, and thanks everybody for joining the talk. And please, you can stop me and ask for clarification, or you can also ask questions at the end. I mean, this is rather informal in a way, so don't be afraid to stop me along the way. So my talk today is about taking the pulse of African tropical forest, and we're just trying to, and I gave this title, trying to think about how healthy these forests are and how they're doing, as if they were a living organism. But in fact, they are, right? I mean, but anyway, let me get started. So, okay, now, so why do we study tropical forests? And I try to put it in a bit of a bigger perspective, because I know not everybody in these seminars are focused on the tropics. So hopefully that's a little bit of a reminder for those that work in other regions of the world. So tropical forests cover about 10% of the Earth land surface, which doesn't seem to be a lot, right? But actually they host about 50% of the biomass carbon, and also about 30% of the net primary production. So they're actually very productive ecosystems. And this is mostly because the constant temperatures are relatively constant temperatures throughout the year, and no major dry season, at least in the humid tropics, and rainfall very often actually makes trees very happy, and they continue to grow and reach great sizes. And I really like this photo with some colleagues. This is in Congo Brazzaville. And you can see how big some of these trees get. They get really huge, and they can be extremely tall. So that's why they're very important for carbon, apart from biodiversity, habitat, and so on, as we talk. So they remove large quantities of carbon from the atmosphere, helping fight climate change or reduce the rate of climate change. But of course, themselves, they're also affected by climate change. And that's what is kind of the challenging scientific question: what's going to happen to them in the future? Because there's mainly two drivers. If increased CO2 fertilization effects help boost the photosynthesis and the potential to reduce water loss when they open the stomata, or if the increased temperatures, as they keep continuing to increase, will actually increase respiration cost, and therefore also the reduced photosynthesis rate, and there'll be an increase in water loss through the stomata. So it's a bit of a balance. So if CO2 effects are bigger, then they continue to act as a carbon sink for longer. But of course, which is good for us as we continue to emit more and more greenhouse gases. But if the increased temperatures start to be greater than the benefits of increased CO2 fertilization, then they actually stop helping us. So I just wanted, of course, they're very big on, or they receive a lot of attention because of the carbon relationship or with climate change mitigation. But I just wanted to remind that tropical forests also contain between 50 and 70% of the Earth's species. And they provide humans with multiple very well-known products that we use very often, maybe every day even. So like coffee, chocolate, the Brazil nuts, and a lot of medicines, just to mention a few. So they're very important, not just for carbon and climate change mitigation, but also because of the biodiversity they host and the products they provide to humans, not to mention the spiritual and other non-material relationships that many indigenous groups or local communities host or relate with the forest. So how do we study tropical forests? So of course we have the remote sensing approaches. We have space or airborne LiDAR scanners, increasingly more terrestrial scanners. And at the end, we have this kind of more zoom out to zoom in, we have the plot remeasurement. And probably the plot remeasurement is the oldest of all these methods, and they might seem a little bit old-fashioned and maybe outdated and not so appealing to the younger generations of scientists, as you may have realized if you have students. But actually, any of the other three approaches rely on this forest plot on the ground measurements to calibrate their approaches. So they continue to be extremely important for our understanding of tropical forests. And this last method, remeasuring many plots, that's what I do. That's what I've been doing the past 15 years. And that's why I've been spending a lot of time in the field, which has been challenging in some cases, of course, but also very rewarding. So what do you do for those that never done some forest plots? This is more or less the kind of recipe guide on how you get about it. So I just thought I'll remind some people how much effort this takes. So first you need to find the funding, the permits from the governments in the countries you want to work, but also the agreements with the local communities, villages that you are visiting, because often there's a more traditional customary land management apart from what the government says about land. Then you finally try to get to the forest plot or patch that you want to study where you got the permit to go or permission. But actually, this is not always so easy because you have to deal with the elephants, which are dangerous when you are on foot. Of course, not so dangerous when you sit in a nice 4x4 car in the savannah. You also deal with gorillas, large snakes, ivory hunters, and gorillas. Yes, humans are also dangerous sometimes. And of course, there's a lot of, or a wide variety of scary tropical disease like the Congo red fever or the yellow fever or the Ebola, just to mention a few, or malaria, of course. Then you usually camp in the rainforest for about 5 days to measure one plot of 1 hectare. So this is about 400 to 600 trees in Africa because there's in general fewer trees in the Africa compared to the other tropical regions. And actually, as I mentioned, you always need to remember to bring in your team a good botanist because we don't have any other tool to, at least not so well developed, to identify the trees on spot if you don't have a botanist. So just a couple of pictures of packing all the food you need for a long field campaign. After you get to the place, the canoe can no longer get there because it's too shallow. Then you start pushing it, or your guys start pushing it. And then even if you camp and find a nice place, maybe your plot happens to be in the other side of a small or rather small river, depending on your standards, and you still need to cross it, and it's a little bit dangerous. So, and in some parts where I work, or some of us work, there's guerrillas or rebels hiding in the forest, so you also need to go with armed guards, as you can see in this picture taken in Eastern DRC. And actually in this area in Eastern DRC is even a no-go zone at the moment because of the conflict. So you also rely on these issues or depend on these insecurity issues to make sure your field campaign that took so long time to get funding and plan and get the permits and so on to make it happen. Maybe you arrive there and it's no longer safe at the moment, so you need to come back in a couple of years. So after all this work of measuring a lot of plots across the tropical Africa, what we have found out, and I say we because you can imagine, you can never do these things alone. So I'm going to present the results from 3 different papers in kind of chronological order, because that's how I kind of got involved and we find out more. So the first one you may know a little bit more about, the other 2 are more recent, but hopefully that just helps set the scene to understand why there's this increasing interest in the mountains and how are they different from the lowlands. So the first paper I'm going to present was published in Nature by my colleague Juan Esubao and another over 200 authors. And what we focus in this paper was comparing what's going on in the Congo Basin forest or the African forest compared to those in the Amazon. And we focus on what we call intact tropical forests, which of course can be debated, but the idea is that at least there's no logging or fires in the recent history that we know. So what we found in this study was that pulling out together the data from many, many different plots, that in the 80s and the 90s, there was actually an increase in the amount of biomass per unit area, of course, in these two continents, from about 0.3 in the 80s, or in the 90s, up to, 80s, yes, 0.3 in Africa in the 80s to 0.6 more or less on average in the 90s, and 0.35 to 0.5 in the Amazon. And actually, this was great news, or we already knew this was great news, because it meant that there was an increase in tree growth, which was most likely related to a CO2 fertilization effect. And just to put it in the bigger picture, this meant that about 46 billion tons of CO2 were removed from the atmosphere during these 20 years, about these 2 decades. But of course, the research had continued. I mean, I was barely born and I was going at school at that time. So what we continued to monitor plots, and what we realized is that in the next 2 decades, the amount of CO2 removed from the atmosphere was decreasing, and at the per unit hectare, and of course, when you compile at the landscape level as well. So it decreased from it started to decrease in Africa between 2010 and 2015, but in the Amazon, this decrease was even more pronounced. And to compare with the previous time period, so between the 80s and the 2000, about 46 billion tons of CO2 were removed from the atmosphere, and in the next 15 years, only 25 billion tons. So about roughly half of what had been removed before, because of the decreased effect of the CO2 fertilization, but also the effects of increased temperatures, and in the Amazon also linked with a major an increase in mortality linked to the major regional drought. So there was the previous paper that had already highlighted this effect of the El Nino, not by El Nino, but the major drought in the Amazon in 2005. And in this figure, every arrow is one plot, and the size of the arrow facing up is increasing, and facing red is decreasing in biomass. So you can see how it was different just in the 2005 drought, how many more plots, those that we've been monitoring for a long time, start to have very high mortality and therefore decreased in their biomass. So what our study showed was that this started to happen also in the African continent. And what we did is that we used this data to predict what may happen. I'm getting confused. I'm going too fast. So this is the data that we have here. So on the top figure, you have the net carbon sink. In the middle figure, you have the carbon gains related to tree growth, but also recruitment, because we measure trees above 10. So if one tree was 9, then it became 10, then we was included in the next census. And then the C panel, you have the increase in mortality. And what you can see, it differs slightly among continents, the African and the Amazon, but most related because of the, while the gains are rather similar, the mortality was bigger in the Amazon. So what we also did is that we used the modeling approach to predict what may happen in the future. And the prediction showed that it would continue to decrease in Africa, but actually in Amazon, it would even reach 0. So there would stop being carbon sink by 2035. And this was linked to the reduced effects of CO2 fertilization, the increased effects of temperatures, but also we would have had to consider the changing rainfall patterns, which are not included in this prediction. So they might be even worse, or the carbon sink stop would happen even earlier. And one of the key points is that, yes, in the 90s, they removed quite a bit of CO2, about 17% of the emissions, but in the 2010s, it was only 6%, because, as I said, not just the unit area sink decline, of course, also there was less forest area because of deforestation, and the CO2 emissions had also increased. So the way tropical forests are helping us mitigate climate change, their strength effect is weakening because of these three variables. And I just wanted to highlight that this research make it to the front cover of Nature because actually none of the current climate-driven vegetation simulations models that we have to predict climate change had considered that the peak in net carbon uptake would be reached in the 30s. So in a way, it's highly likely that the climate change impacts of any emission scenario or socioeconomic pathway is even worse than it's predicted, just because everybody thought that the tropical forest would continue to help us for longer than they're actually going to do. And as I said, this research was not me. I only did a small part, but it was led by my colleague Juanes, and there was 183 other scientists from 36 countries involved. So I think it also helps highlight how when we put our efforts together, we can really try to understand the role of forests, the way forests are behaving in the bigger picture, which is very important to make policy interventions, right? So my second paper that I wanted to share with you today was about the carbon dynamics in the mountains, and this is the work I've been leading that was inspired by my collaboration in this previous paper that I showed you. So I work more, not just in the lowlands, but in the mountains. And in the mountains, trees are a little bit different. I'm sure you have observed that. They tend to be shorter. They tend to have fewer of these extremely large trees that I showed you before in those photos. And also they tend to have lower diversity. And this is related to what we call environmental filtering. Sorry. And it's because in mountain areas, it's generally lower temperatures, so colder. They tend to be more covered with clouds, so that lowers photosynthesis. Also tends to be more water dripping from the mosses and the leaves, as you can see in this photo here. And then that makes soils often quite waterlogged, which decrease nutrient decomposition in the soil and therefore nutrient availability to trees. Of course, also in mountain ridges, you have exposure to wind or maybe lightning that decreases the possibility of having these huge trees with the big buttresses. So because of these different drivers, one would expect that there would be less carbon in the mountain forest compared to the lowland forest, because trees are shorter, there's fewer species and fewer of the large trees. That's how previous work had shown. So this was a paper, the little figure you see here, where it compared mountain and lowland forests in the tropical Asia and the Neotropics, and indeed it was lower carbon in the mountain areas. But as you can see, no plot data from Africa had been used for this study. So that's what I did. I contacted a lot of people, to be about 100 people, asking if they were willing to share some of the plot data, and I put it together from different inventories in different countries. And at the end, I had 226 plots from 46 sites in 13 African countries. And what we found out was that the average above ground biomass or above ground carbon in the mountain forests of Africa was actually not significantly differently than in the lowlands. And it was higher than that reported for the Neotropics, that reported from Southeast Asia, and also higher than the previous value used in the IPCC assessments. Of course, there's a wider spread, as you can see in the pink color in the figure. There's wider variation in the mountains, but on average, or most of these plots actually are not significantly different. And then, of course, we start wondering, why is this different in the African continent? So it turns out that the structure of these mountain forests in Africa in general, of course, there's always some differences, is very similar to the lowland forest in Africa. So you have a lower density of stems, so just about 450 per hectare, not 600, 700, or 800 as in other parts of the world. But you tend to have more of these very large trees, and in this case, we call a large tree above 70 centimeters diameter. So you have more of these large trees, and of course, these large trees tend to have more carbon because they're bigger, taller, and maybe some of them also have a higher wood density. And then, of course, the question now is, why do we have these large trees in the mountains of Africa? And we actually think that it's related to the presence of large herbivores, particularly the elephants. So elephants not only disperse the seeds of the biggest trees that are very big, and help them germinate, but they also consume biomass. They bend some of the small stems, and by bending them and destroying some of them, they create space, or they open the opportunity for some trees that are already there to grow bigger. And we think that it's also very important in the mountains, the fact that they disperse nutrients with their excrements. Of course, this is something that we haven't tested yet, that is the effect, because the preliminary work shows that areas with elephant presence and areas with no elephant presence in the mountain don't have significantly different above ground carbon. But also one needs to think about the potential time lag between when an area lost its elephant population and until we can see that effect in the vegetation or the forest structure. They might take 1 to 2 centuries to be able to see that. And most of the elephant extirpation has happened in the last 100 or 200 years. And at the same time, we also need to think that in some cases, high abundance of elephants in some areas linked to maybe protected areas being fenced by electric fences has created an extremely high abundance of elephants and pressure in some of these mountain forests, something we're still trying to study. But anyway, that's a great idea for future research. If you are interested, please get in touch with me. So now the next question is like, how will the mountain forest change in the future? Will they also be affected by the CO2 fertilization effect and therefore increase their carbon over time, or would they be negatively affected by the increased temperature and decrease their carbon? So that brings me to my third paper that I wanted to share with you today, that was published last year. And in that paper, we tried to assess the effects of climate change on the mountains in mountain forests of Africa. And just to remind everybody, I like this diagram. So species in general when they're faced with climate change impacts or changing environmental conditions in the place where they live, they're presented with 3 possibilities. They can either adapt, or maybe eat something different, change their phenology, or exploit a resource they never exploited before. They can maybe migrate. This is good for things that move, particularly birds, for example. But of course, trees also migrate through the dispersal of their seeds, establishment, and so on. And they can also go extinct. And in mountain areas, usually it's those found at high elevations that are more likely to go extinct because they have nowhere to move. So nowhere to move to the new increased temperature, ideal temperature range for them, because this temperature does no longer exist in the mountains. So this is an example from tree birds communities in Peru. So what we did in this third paper that I wanted to share with you is that we looked at the composition of the plant communities, in this case, the forest, the tree communities in the forest, to try to see if there was a change in the species abundance and related to warmer climates. So if there was an increased abundance of species from lower elevation or that had broader thermal ranges or requirements, compared to those that are more typical of the highest elevation. So previous work from the Americas by Feli mostly showed that most plant communities in the Americas had experienced thermophilization. There has been an increase in abundance of more thermal affiliated or warmer loving species, to put it in a way. And these, in the case of mountain forest, that has also been shown for the Andes, for the tropical mountain forest of the Andes, where most of the plot sample, about 75% in this study by Belén Fadrique, showed an increased abundance of warmer climate-loving species. And what they calculated, the thermal migration rate was about 0.0066 degrees. And I know this seems very small, but it's actually a big change for the for species that are set in tropical forests, that they usually have very narrow thermal ranges. And there was also another work in this case, not in the Andes, but in Costa Rica, where they also reported similar rates of thermophilization in terms of number of plots, but also in terms of thermal migration rate. So what's going on in Africa? So we went back with some colleagues and we measured plots in Bwindi in Uganda, and Volcanis in Rwanda, and in the Udzungwa Mountains of Tanzania. And that's what we found. We actually found that also about 75% of the plots measured had observed, or we could find an increased abundance of more warmer climate-loving species, and that the thermal migration rate was actually a little bit lower than that reported from the Andes before. And And in the case of Africa, the changes in composition was related to a combination of increased mortality of colder loving species and increased abundance of warmer loving species, which is different from what was reported in the Andes, because in the Andes it was mostly related to just increased mortality. And we think that this is different in Africa because of the composition of the tropical forest in Africa. So as you can see in this diagram, most of the, or a wider percentage of the tree species found in tropical mountain forests in Africa have as wide a niche breadth, or their thermal optic is a little bit on warmer climate. And we think that this is related because to the history of the tropical forests in Africa. So for those that you don't know what happened, the tropical forests of Africa, particularly those of the Congo Basin and West Africa, have a very unique history where during the cold arid phases of the Ice Age, they contracted and expanded. So they were not like the Amazon that was always there. There were periods of time where they were more contracted to either more mountain or hilly areas that were a bit colder, or more towards the swamp areas of the Congo Basin. So we think that that might be a legacy, the fact that the species in the more of the tree species in the mountain forests of Africa have these different or broader niche breadths compared to those in the Andes. So now this is about the species. I'm an ethnobotanist, so I like talking about the species. But let me go back to carbon. So the question was, would CO2 fertilization boost carbon or continue to increase carbon stocks, or would the negative effects of increased temperature, and as we just reported, of changes in species composition, translate into a reduced carbon sink strength? So what we found that for the study period that we have here, there is only 10 years, so it's much shorter than the study period I showed you for the first paper. The mean change was still positive, about 0.95 megagrams of carbon per hectare, which is similar to 0.7 for the same study period in the lowlands. And then there was no relationship between the above ground carbon change and thermophilization effects, so the changes in species composition. But again, we only monitored these forests for 10 years, which is very different from the first study that I showed you, where they had been monitored for about 50 years, or at least some of the plots had been monitored for longer periods of time. So it may be that we are not seeing the effects yet because our time or period of monitoring is rather short. So, the idea of this last one was just to remind you guys that we report indeed some increased mortality for some species. The increase in carbon gains continues to be in the forest we monitor in the mountains, but of course it might be behaving different just because our time period monitoring is very short. We should have started monitoring the forest, the tropical mountain forest in the African continent in the 80s, which is not the case. We mostly started in the 2010s. And I just wanted to remind you that everything I presented is focused on intact tropical forests, those that are not affected by recent logging or fires. But of course, there are not many of these left in the continent or in the world in general. So part of the work we do on tropical mountain forests is to highlight how deforestation rates are higher in the mountains and how they are more threatened. So this is a figure where it's a little bit hard to understand, and I'm sorry, guys, but the idea is that green stands for lowland forests and purple or pinkish or light purple stands for mountains. And the point in this figure is that the bar shows percentage of mountain forests in each country compared to lowlands. So many of the East African countries have more mountain than lowland forests. So it's more important for their commitments into, for example, what's going on in the mountain forest for the Paris climate agreements, but also the dots on that figure show how the deforestation rates differ between lowland and mountain. And you can see also that for Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, DRC, Cameroon, deforestation rates are higher in the mountain forest than the lowlands, and they have received less attention scientifically, but also in terms of policy in up to recent times. So in summary, carbon dynamics in the lowlands of Africa are changing. Carbon dynamics in the mountain forests of Africa, they have high carbon, but little forest left, as I said. And it seems that climate change is impacting at least the composition changes in these forests. So, but we need to continue monitoring them to understand what may continue to happen in the future. And just to finish off, I wanted to say that to be able to run this large-scale comparison and analysis across time and across space, you need big teams and you need big team effort. And just to measure even one of these plots, particularly those in most remote locations, you also need big team effort, as you can see in this photo. And yeah, that's why some of us, or many of us that works in the tropical areas, especially those very least accessible and studies, we think it's very important to think about how we make forests data fair and open, particularly plot data that it's gathered under very challenging conditions. If you, hopefully I gave a hint on that, by people that have very limited opportunities in their careers or access to finance and so on, because we, unfortunately, if funding has been cut in the institutions in the north, the situation in the south is even worse, as you can imagine. So I just would like to thank all the funders that helped my work, I mean, me as leading this work, but also the colleagues involved in this work. And to finalize by saying that we hope to, I mean, together we can inspire more of these younger generations to be interested in forest monitoring using different approaches, but particularly those based on forest plots, and particularly building a team of more young botanists, because that's something that at the moment we still rely field botanists on, and there are not many. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions, comments, or provide extra explanation.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, we have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So people are welcome to put their hand up and ask a question, and lots of applause coming. Or you can put a question in the chat box. I think I'll start just so people can warm up and think of their questions. But I'm struck by your focus on intact forests. It's where you start, but as you point at the end there, this wave of degradation that's going on in Africa and across the tropics more broadly, in logging, in degradation then, and in fire. Have you got any thoughts as to how those two processes might degrade the capacity of these forests to stock carbon in the future?
Yeah, I think it's even worse when you start considering the degradation of the forest. So for fire, because I work in the humid tropics, I don't have a lot of insights on that. I'm sure colleagues working in more of the drier forests like the Miombo, that's my much bigger role. I'm not saying it is not, it might be, but it's not probably as big as the effects of logging. And the problem with logging, we've been monitoring some plots that were logged, but the problem is that in some of these historical logging, they didn't record the volumes harvested, or they didn't record all the species present. They only focused on recording the harvestable or interesting, useful species for timber, right? So it's hard to compare once you go now, even if the plot was set up before, because some things were not recorded. So I think that's a big challenge, that it's hard to quantify the different types of logging and their legacies because of this lack of historical data that is comparable. I'm not saying it was high quality for the purpose they set up at the time, probably, but it's harder these days. There is a bit, and I know there's a couple of projects trying to do a bit more, but yeah, I guess there's also, I mean, if I can add on, I think it probably, I mean, the likelihood is that it just makes the forest even less healthy, if it makes sense, right? That they're more prone to, I don't know, the effects of droughts or big storms, wind, or things like this, as research has shown for other parts of the world, right? But I think we have very limited understanding of how this, because logging can mean many things, right? We are not talking about clear cutting, we're talking about selective recording, not recording different species, different types of machineries, different time intervals between. So I think it's challenging, but it's definitely an area that we should know more and understand more about, because yeah, the intact forests are decreasing, and maybe the degraded forests are the ones that are going to help us more mitigate climate change or provide other services to our to humans, right? So we should also do more research on them, indeed.
Great, thank you. John Healy.
Thank you very much indeed. It does a really clear presentation, lesson for us all. I want to make a bridge between David's question and thermophilization. So you may or may not have seen the paper in Ecography that I was a co-author on a couple of years ago about the Blue Mountain forests in Jamaica, which are in a very hurricane-prone area. Yeah. So what we showed there, at least to an extent, is that severe disturbance, in this case, natural disturbance of hurricanes, seem to accelerate the rate of thermophilization. The mechanism seems to be because, of course, it's just increasing the rate of tree turnover, which just accelerates the opportunities for lower altitude species of trees to colonize higher up. So bridging to David's question, would your prediction be in Africa or anywhere else that human disturbance, even if it's just small-scale selective logging, might actually accelerate thermophilization rates as well?
Yeah, it's highly likely, to be honest. I mean, I think it is way possible. But I think what is the challenging, or what people ask me, is what it means, right? Because if we have more of these lower elevation species coming in, which some of them at least may reach greater sizes, so these extremely large trees, and some of them may also have relatively hard wood. Maybe it's not bad news, right? That we are having more of the low elevations. Maybe over time we get more carbon. But I think in the what we don't understand very well as well is the role of clouds, or I'm not sure in your case, in your study in Jamaica, I've seen it. It was a great, very inspirational paper. But I think it's also the role of cloud cover, how it plays in these dimensions, because, okay, maybe these species can tolerate warmer temperatures and they're okay, but what it means with now this reduced cloud cover, reduce waterlogging of the soils and increase in nutrient availability, maybe it will also change the way species compete for nutrients and interacts, because many of these trees rely on arborescera or ectomycorrhiza or other types of mycorrhiza, right? So I think there's also this effect of the soils that it's extremely little research and we don't know much about, right? How this affects, growth or even establishment or changes in the composition of the forest, and what it means for carbon or climate change mitigation, right? So, yeah.
That's a great reply. We need to know more about these ericoids. Yeah, thank you.
There's a question in the Cambridge room. Don't know who's going to ask.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the talk. It's really cool. I was thinking about how climate changes in climatic patterns might differ in different regions across Africa, and especially when we think about the drought and water cycle and drought response. So that might be had a lot of regional variation. So in light of that, my question is: do you think that in the current pod network there are specific gaps or places which should be prioritized for us to get areas where we don't know as much as other places where there should be more efforts in setting up monitoring efforts?
Indeed, I think this is a very good point. So I think if we think about the lowlands, the swamp forests are very little studied. So I know there's a couple of projects now trying to understand their dynamics there, because also in that case is the changing in flooding regimes that will also affect what happens to them in the future, and potentially the peatland decomposition and release of carbon, which of course is a big worry because the biggest tropical peatland is found in DRC, Congo, Brazza, and away, right? So I think this is a huge gap that we need to know more, and there's some efforts starting to put it, but of course, like the current situation in DRC, for example, now it's put all or most of the research on hold, so that's also a challenge, right? And then in the mountain areas, in our current plot network, I think we cover a wide range of more drier forests, like in Ethiopia or Eastern Africa, to more wetter, or perhumid, like like as I said, in the Albertine Reef, so in Eastern DRC or so on. And then we have some in West Africa. But I must say that this is an unfunded project. So I have a small project now going on to continue to monitor some of these plots, but it's mostly an effort made by different groups. Most of them actually not working on carbon or anything. They're just interested in habitat monitoring for gorillas or some other kind of cool or flagship species. So it's also I think it's been a process of trying to standardize approaches, how these efforts these other teams are already doing can be done a little bit better, so then we can use them for carbon. So I think that's why I'm a very collaborative person, but also I think it's very important that we agree on certain standards, and I think that's something that we can do in this center, right? If we have limited resources, which happen to be the case in many locations in the world, right? What can we prioritize, or what little extra can we do that can really help us understand many more things later? So yeah, great points about not just which plots are out there or where we need to put more, but also how we can help some of these less well established or financed plots do a little bit better, so we can answer more questions. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Sorry, Chris has a question, but first our Casey's put one in the chat, and he says he's somewhere noisy, so I'll read it out. But is there any scope to extend the plot network into non-intact areas? Will the methods work? For example, I agree with your point that otherwise we might miss out understanding crucial changes for ecosystem services.
Yes, so there are some plots already in disturbed or more locked areas. My feeling, and that's just a personal opinion based on my experience, that there's fewer of them, at least in the African continent, that focus on disturbance. And I think it's mostly the challenge is this, as I said, is that trying to really quantify what was the disturbance. So that's why fewer efforts have focused on that, but it's very important to do. And sorry, I missed the second part of it. Could you read it again, David?
Yeah, I mean, he said, will the methods work? I think that's the key part, because he says he agrees with your point that otherwise we might be missing crucial things.
Yeah, so I think it depends on which disturbance we are talking about. So if we refer to methods for plot measurement, I think it's always the same. I guess we just need to add on, I don't know, like, for example, I know for fire, it's not just when it happened, but which was the intensity, how far it burned in the soil, for example, and other things. So I think for some disturbances, it's adding a little bit more to it. But I think there's well-developed tools to, or at least for some other for specific disturbances that are a little bit well studied that we could apply, yes. But I think that the challenge really to understand it is that, I mean, in a way, ideally, you just monitor an intact forest, then log some trees and see what happens, right? So you know everything. The problem with that, of course, is that we have very little intact forest left. It's mostly in protected areas or areas really inaccessible. And also, we don't want to destroy it, right? Because there's not a lot left. So that's why we use a lot of trying to infer historical things that happen, and then, or sometimes just like experiments that by chance happen. So I have a good friend that was they had this field campaign in Australia to study the long-term effects of drought. And suddenly he arrived in the field and it had been a major flooding. All his equipment was floating in the water in his plots. He was devastated. But actually it was an opportunity to understand the combined effects of different disturbances, which is also a challenge that we are likely to face more in the future, right? That it's not just one thing, or research teams that study one focus on fire, on logging, whatever, actually disturbance often interact, and then we don't understand these interactions very well either.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, hi, thanks for a really great talk. I was just wondering where you see, so you focus, obviously you're focused in Africa, and you make lots of comparisons between African tropical forests and those in the Amazon. I was just wondering where you think the role of Southeast Asian tropical forests sits. Presumably that's based on the data you have available, but do you think that they represent more the Amazon case or the African case, and also how important they might be in the future with climate change, because we're perhaps not yet seeing, having lots of drying out and increasing fires and droughts in the Amazon and also in Africa to a lesser extent, but not so much in Asian tropical forests yet. So where do you see the kind of role for them in the future?
No, I mean, it's a great point. I think there's been less research in the Asian area. So that's why we know less. So particularly in the mountains. So when I started this Africa mountain stuff, I wanted to compare the 3 continents, and I reached out to a lot of people and quite a lot of teams working in Asia, but it was hard to get enough plot data that could actually put a comparison. So I think that's a big research gap on the Asian or tropical mountains at least. And part of it is driven by the situation in Papua New Guinea. There is not a lot of research, is hard to access and so on, right? But I think, yeah, it should be a big focus. And I think in terms of what's happening to them, most likely they are, or they will reach a point where this CO2 fertilization effect is also going to be less. I mean, they will reach like the point where the negative effects of climate change start to kick in. And I'm not sure about the predictions for Southeast Asia because I don't work in the region, of course, but the ones related to increased temperature in mountains for sure are the same, and the lifting cloud base, which is a big challenging for mountain species. So those will definitely happen, regardless of the changing in rainfall and so on. So I think, yeah, we definitely need more research in that area. But maybe also there's been less research attention because they have more lowlands. So probably that's the same problem as in the African continent, right? That, well, the biggest are the Amazon or the Congo Basin or, I don't know, Borneo, Papua New Guinea, and so on. So we focus on the lowlands for a reason. I mean, I'm not saying it's not right. I think it's great. But I think we also need to focus on what's going on in the mountains to really understand the whole picture. And not just, as we were saying here, no, not just intact, but also all these gradients of degradation and combinations of degrading factors. Yeah, indeed. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you.
All right. I think that's all the questions we've got, and there's lots of thanks in the chat as well. But so with that, I think I'd just like to say a final big thank you to you, Aida. Really appreciate wonderful, very interesting talk and discussion. And then a reminder that we won't be having any more seminars for July or August. That's our summer break, but we'll welcome everyone back in early September. I think it's David Lindenmayer will give a presentation on his work on forest logging, etc. in Australasia. But one last time, everyone, please, thanks so much to you, Aida.
No, thank you guys for coming. Bye. Have a nice day.
All right, take care, Aida.
Take care. Bye-bye.